Hi, welcome to Heliotropes. I'm Julia.
I'm Kwadjo.
And today we're going to maybe talk about several things.
Yeah.
But we're going to start with Texas passing and the Supreme Court upholding the 6-week abortion ban in Texas, which means that folks who are pregnant cannot get an abortion after being pregnant for 6 weeks. And just to put that into perspective for some folks, I got pregnant a few months ago. Didn't know I was pregnant until I was 7 weeks pregnant, because you measure the pregnancy at the point of your last period. So for a lot of folks, right, like you don't know until you're pregnant after you've missed a period or a cycle. And for some folks, their menstrual cycles aren't regular, right? So essentially, I mean, this law is essentially outlawing abortion in the state of Texas. And other parts of that law that were passed as well were, and I don't know like everything about it, so I'll just share what I do know, that it makes it a civilian can sue another civilian for up to $10,000 if they know that that person went, even if it's out of state, to get an abortion, or aided somebody in getting an abortion, or provided the abortion. Right, so for example, if we were in Texas right now and I decided I was going to go to Philadelphia and my sister was going to help me get an abortion, I could be sued, my sister could be sued, and whoever provides that service could be sued as well. Just as civilians. They have civilians narking on civilians for abortion. And what we know about when abortion is outlawed is that it doesn't stop abortions from happening. It simply stops safe abortions from happening. So people will continue to try and find ways to terminate a pregnancy and will end up harming themselves or somebody else in the process and potentially killing themselves. And by the Supreme Court upholding this law in Texas, there is, like in a lot of ways the alarmists were right. Like they weren't actually alarmists, right? This is essentially overturning Roe v. Wade. And so, there's, I think, a lot of appropriate concern that could spread to many other states, because over the past decades really, and I think it's become more apparent in the past few years too, that a lot of states have been setting this up so they could outlaw abortion. And so, we're in a it's upsetting on a lot of levels, and there's also some racial context that's important too to discuss, in the way that a lot of white women are talking about that it's a handmaid's tale come true, because a lot of the things that are now outlawed for white women have always been outlawed for black and brown women in this country. And now that it is impacting white women, it has become their worst fears come true, even though those things have been happening since this country came into existence. So there's a lot of that white women feminism weaponizing bullshit going on.
That was pretty comprehensive. Yeah. See y'all next time. Just kidding. Of course, we've got more. As far as abortion is concerned, I think one of the things that really, there's a lot of things to focus on. And I think if we zoom out, one of the things that I like to focus on, right, of course it's a question, really is why is this such a big deal in our political discourse? Why do people feel so strongly about abortion that they'll vote, right? Like abortion is famously, regarded in this country as one of the top single issues of an election cycle. Like candidates can run and get elected on abortion alone, right? Like whether you're pro-abortion or anti-abortion, or whatever the rhetoric around those things are. So I think that's really interesting, and it's something to consider, because, a lot of times, as Julia just laid out, physiologically, this law stands to, and, the Supreme Court's failure to, void it, nullify it, stands to, impact a lot of people's lives. But there's this question, people really often get stuck on abortion and like debating the pros and cons, debating whether or not it should be illegal or not, without looking past that and asking why is this even a question, right? Like if we look at Europe, it's not a question there. If we look at like, anyway, I mean, there's a lot of things to look at as far as why. I don't think it should be a question. You know, whether, I mean, we're bringing it down to like, you know, what, my body, my choice, like a woman's right to her own body, their own bodies, all these things. So, I mean, I guess the ask here from me on my end is to, I mean, look beyond the issue and look into the context of why this issue is a thing. Because, of course, there's this whole history around, I mean, you know, the racial dynamics present and and historical. I don't know. Like, God.
One of the very succinct like answers to your question that I've seen out there. Well, your question covers like a lot of different segments, right? Like to respond to it. And one of the things that I've seen out there about, you know, because I think there is a question about like, why are they doing this? Like, why have conservative folks spent decades getting certain judges appointed and trying to get the Supreme Court in a place and trying to get, right, like everything on par to overturn Roe v. Wade to make abortion illegal again? And a very succinct Twitter take from Amani Barbary or Barbari, I'm not sure how you pronounce her last name, was that the idea is to force people to have babies to further incarceration and basically to further, right, like slavery and production and the economy in that capacity. And I think that's, you know, like obviously, like I think there's a lot of things there to elaborate on, and, you know, they have and will and connect it to a lot of different pieces. But I think that's a really important context, like, because there's the question, right? It's not just, well, I think the question can be asked in a lot of different ways. Why are people forcing other people to have children when they don't want the child, when it puts the child at risk, when it puts the person at risk? You know, what is the obsession with, you know, like forcing, and in this scenario, forcing white women to have babies, right? Because there's also, you know, like the United States, excuse me, as a government, has spent a lot of efforts sterilizing and preventing, you know, reproduction of Black and brown and poor women in this country. So, I don't know. There's just so many different pieces to talk about. I do think one of the, like you brought up rhetoric, and I think that's an important piece too, right? Because the people who are doing this are supposedly pro-life folks, right? So pro-life that, you know, they're also the same people who don't want to wear masks, who shouted "my body, my choice" when they were told to wear masks to help keep other people safe, right? Who want to invade and support wars and support the military-industrial complex, who are
pro-capital punishment.
Yeah, exactly. Pro-capital punishment, who think that like having 1 million guns and being able to stand your ground in certain states and be able to shoot somebody for coming on your property is totally fine. They're the people who want to strip away social services, who want kids to be in lunch debt so they can't eat, who don't want to house folks, who think people who are addicted deserve to die and don't deserve treatment. They're the same people who, right, like boost pharma and insurance companies, who, you know, think that having health insurance is a privilege and not a right? Like, these are people who really spend a lot of their money and a lot of their mental energy in figuring out how to make other people suffer and die for their own benefit, and then get other people on board.
Yeah. And I think, for the record, because especially towards the end there, you know, a lot of those things apply to non-critical political observers on the left and the right.
Yes.
Right. So a lot of times we think of, you know, like anti-abortion folks as people on the right, you know, conservative Americans, white, But it is important to note that that current exists on the left as well, and I would also make a distinction between politicians, right? The politicians and the people themselves. So as we know, it's really common practice amongst politicians, let alone right-wing politicians who get elected on their abortion stances and things, that if someone in their family is having an unwanted pregnancy, they'll go get abortions, right? And that's another one of those things that's commonly reminded of, is that this is going to become it's going to crack down. The legal ramifications are going to hit people of color and poor people much harder than they're going to hit rich white people, because like Julia said, people are still going to be having abortions. People are still going to be offering abortion services. It's just the people who are going to be able to afford it, access those services, are the people who are going to get them. And it's really restricting. It puts a huge bottleneck, or a small bottleneck, on access for the public.
Yeah, and with the piece about accessing them, right? So regardless of, supposedly how wealthy you are in Texas, excuse me, you won't be able to access an abortion in Texas unless, you're a fucking
cattle rancher,
fortune teller.
Yes.
And can tell the future and be like, oh, I just had sex. I think there's something implanting in me now. Right. I should go take care of this. But, excuse me, you'll be able to leave the state, right? And nobody in your circle is going to tell on you. But what we know is going to happen now is that, first of all, poor folks aren't going to be able to leave the state. The state of Texas is fucking gigantic. So just put that into perspective, right? It would take hours. So it takes all sorts of resources to be able to leave the state. And then what? Then you need to get time off of work, right? And if the state is encouraging folks to narc for $10,000, that's a lot of money. So people are going to be overseeing that, right? Your good old community policing folks, are going to be on top of that shit. The people who stand outside Planned Parenthood with their fetus pictures or baby murdering signs or whatever, they are going to be the people on your Nextdoor app trying to figure out who got an abortion so they can go through the process and fuck somebody over and get money for themselves. Yeah. So I think, just to clarify the access point, because access is likely going to be very diminished in Texas. So there's still going to be there's going to be neighborhood people who will do it, right? And then for the rich people, there's going to be private doctors who will go to their houses. And the neighborhood people who are going to be doing it on their kitchen tables, right? That's going to be unsafe. And, it's not like we live in a country where you can go to the local drugstore and buy pain meds for $5. I don't even need to get started on that.
And, not to sensationalize, but as you were talking about, that access and the people who are going to be, putting on the badge, the newly deputized, Stasi, comment if you get that reference, but it's for real like that, community police state. The police state operates best when it can mobilize its civilian population to enforce the law. That's literally Nazi shit. It's literally Soviet Russian KGB shit. It's literally Imperial Russia oprichniki shit. It's just the way they operate. But thinking about the parallels, right, the overlap between that population, who's going to take it upon themselves to enforce this law, and the number of people, because again, we're talking about Texas, and that was what reminded me of this, people who go and take it upon themselves with arms to patrol the borders and literally shoot people, human beings, who are trying to cross the border. It's just one of those things that kind of puts the whole pro-life stance into perspective, pro-life rhetoric again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it drives me crazy that people use those names.
Yeah. I do, but the right has always been pretty solid at marketing, branding
Yeah, I
got
mean,
that game down.
yeah, and that's one of the like. I mean, there were a few things that came up, but that's one of the really disheartening things too, right? That they really played the long game, and meanwhile, the Democrats are like, well, they're acting surprised, as if like people hadn't seen this coming for years and for decades, like this wasn't going to happen, and well, no, like we still don't need the filibuster, we still don't need these things, or we don't need to explore these things, or we don't need to make significant changes, right? And like that goes to what you said, like it's no sweat off any of the Democrats' backs, right? If certain people can't get abortions anymore, they don't care because they are benefiting from all of the same stuff.
And I mean, to bring it back, because I mean, what you said earlier, I forgot about like the claims of alarmism against people who are like fearful of like the nomination of the Republican, the Trump era nominees to the Supreme Court. Who's that? Kavanaugh and
That other fucking lady, Amy Coney Barrett.
and Kasich.
Oh, right.
Is that his
Gorsuch.
name? Gorsuch, yeah.
Or
Yeah.
something.
Gorsuch, Barrett, and Kavanaugh. I've forgotten about that. I'm still not convinced that the Supreme Court's going to overturn. Or okay, I'll put it like this: before the pandemic, I was not convinced that the Supreme Court was going to overturn Roe v. Wade.
Yep, I remember.
And I'm still not super convinced. That Twitter take to me sounds hyperbolic. But what I will say is that, and this goes with like right-wing ideas in general, like in part we're going back to, like why is this question of abortion even a question, right? Before the 1960s, it wasn't a question. It was like people were not getting elected on their abortion stance. After the 1960s, people were, right? And like that's one of the things we see. We've talked on this podcast about like the shift in like racial dynamics and the language around race, specifically to get elected, right? Like the Southern Strategy 1970 or 68 to get Nixon elected, right? Oh, we can't, the strategy was to appeal to disenfranchised, and by disenfranchised I don't mean like actually disenfranchised, I mean like they felt disenfranchised, classic Southern white voters who were like, oh, all these black people are getting all this stuff after the 60s, and like what are we getting besides affirmative action? And we've talked about that too. So there was a whole political strategy around appealing to those folks, but the campaign runners couldn't come out right, and you appeal to race, right? So they had to appeal to race adjacent concepts and words that people were familiar with: crime, violence, gangs, things like that. Because after the turmoil of the 60s, riots were a thing. I mean, all these things, and like the imagery, right? So all they had to do was show some imagery of riots and like tell Southern white people, formerly racist, now reformed, automatically, people that they were going to be tough on crime and things like that. And okay, like in a nutshell, what I'm saying is that after, like, coinciding with that time period was a phenomenon where, and again, this is also as like big business is starting to become bigger and bigger, to have a bigger hand in politics, right? In getting people elected, in campaign financing, and outsourcing our jobs. So people are getting, like, average people are losing jobs, they're losing work, they're falling into these situations where obviously people are going to resort to extra legal means of making work, right? And then that's going to double, like, politicians are going to be able to double down on the crime thing, and then we get to the 80s crack epidemic, and who put that crack in the neighborhood, we know who did it. But point is, politicians started moving away from actual issues, like you think about the Great Society, oh, we're going to end this war, or like fight this war. We're going to increase social welfare programming. I mean, even Nixon himself is credited with having a more liberal or left-leaning healthcare plan than Obama did, right? We have unions who are coming to an end in the 70s, right? Like union activism, so getting people behind fair wages and like, you know, right to work and like all these things as organizing as political, like at the forefront of our political consciousness. All that stuff is going away because politicians are starting to say, oh, okay, like what we really need to do in order to get the business, you know, special interests happy is trick the people. And I'm paraphrasing a lot, like this is a gross summary, but we need to trick the people into caring about things that don't actually matter, right? Because if the people come to the polls and they vote for work, they vote for, you know, healthcare, they vote for education, they vote for all those things, then we're going to be fucked. You know, like the special interests, they're not going to want to give us money. They're going to be upset. They're not going to get what they want, right? And again, this goes back to even the last podcast we did. Like the special interests have been advocating for this kind of stuff for a long time. Like here in the States, as well as in the rest of the world, right? Like they advocate for reductions in public expenditure in education, healthcare, infrastructure, like all these things. So we're seeing the same thing here, and we've been seeing the same thing for the past 70, 50 years. And that's, again, to say that this is when we started to see issues like abortion come up, issues like gun control, issues like, what are some other, like, ridiculous single issue things, is, because when you think about, I mean, like, you know, whether abortion is illegal or not, like, yes, people's lives are going to be like impacted, and to me, it makes a lot of sense to advocate for abortion to be legal. It makes sense to advocate for abortion access. What doesn't make sense is to advocate for abortion to be legal in a country where we have the ostensible, you know, like separation of church and state. One, right? Like, it literally doesn't make sense, you know, because that's another thing we've got to recognize is that, you know, besides all the motives that Julia mentioned earlier, there's also, you know, on a deeply personal level, not for me, but for a lot of people, there's the religious angle, right? People will be like, oh, the right to life, you know, like the fetus is alive at conception, so it has the right, all the rights of people. And right, this is a huge, like, philosophical quagmire. Like, it's really ridiculous, like, how long, it's how many centuries philosophers have been, like, debating over what it means to be alive, what it means to have life, what it means to have personhood, right? And then, like, you know, someone just comes out of the blue and they're like, yep, that fetus is a person. It deserves all the same rights. You're like, even if, you know, and going down the list of conditions that make perfect sense, and they're like, yeah, even if those things, you know, so clearly, you know, the consensus is a fetus has exactly the same rights as any of us and should be held as such. That's not the consensus. That's a ridiculous consensus. But I just wanted to bring it back there to, like, how abortion came onto the map. And then there's this other, you know, kind of shedding a little bit more light on it. You know, we can go back to Margaret Sanger and, like, Planned Parenthood and Margaret Sanger's career. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that right now. Do you have anything?
I mean, I was just thinking, like, the idea, sometimes I forget that people think life starts at conception, because even in this case, like, that doesn't matter to me. You know, thinking about it, that's fine. Like, if you think that, that's fine, and I should still be able to have an abortion if I want an abortion. And I'm pro-abortion, like, not just pro-choice, you know, like, if you want an abortion, great, have an abortion. I don't care if it is day one. I don't care if it's the day before your due date. Like, that is your choice and your right to make that decision. And the idea that life begins at conception, so the fetus has the same amount of rights as everybody else, decreases the rights of the person carrying that fetus, and also treats that fetus as more important than at least 13% of the population of this country, right? Like, in terms of how the government actually treats folks. And yeah, I mean, there's just so much hypocrisy in all of it, especially from the religious folks around abortion. And and being pro-life, like whatever that means for them. It's really pro-birth. It's and for what, right? Like they don't. It's not that like they're offering to help in any sort of capacity at all. In fact, we know that they're busy going to other countries doing missionary work to steal babies and bring them back to the United States, right? So, yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that sometimes I think about and do not understand how it's a conversation that's still happening, right? And I do think it goes beyond the idea. Like oftentimes what people say is like, well, men want to control like women's bodies and that's why this is happening. And I think that is a much too simplistic explanation for why abortion bans happen and why people are so hell-bent on people giving birth. I think it goes much deeper. And, you know, there's this, and I don't know exactly what it is. Like, I haven't thought about it or put a lot of words to it, but if you want a whole populations of people to be having babies to the point that you want to make it illegal and arrest people and fire other people and give other people money and this and that and the other thing, you know, there has to be more reasons other than just wanting control. And it's not that you want to control somebody else's body either. That's certainly part of it, but perhaps wanting to maintain status, perhaps wanting to like maintain a workforce to build some white ethno state, you know, like there's just so many other pieces there. And if the religious folks cared half as much about taking care of each other as they pretend to care about fidi, is that the appropriate Latin plural? Fetuses, you know, like this country would definitely be a hell of a lot better off.
Yeah. And now I'm speaking personally. I will say that I think, I mean, when you mentioned, you know, the thing about like thinking that people should have the right to an abortion, whether it's like the day of conception or like the day before, you know, like for the full term of pregnancy, essentially. And that's not necessarily something I disagree with, but I do think that, again, this is one of those things where the actual debate on the process of abortion needs to be far more nuanced, right? Like it's one of those things. I mean, that point is just so incendiary in common discussion, right? Like that it's just not as a rhetorical point. Like I don't think it's super effective, right? Even if it makes sense. Even if it makes sense, period, in reality. So, but like one of the things that I do really appreciate it is that it reminds me that like we need to be able to talk about these things, right? Because like when we're talking about, like a lot of people get up in arms about late term abortion, right? Like just that term, late term abortion. And people are like, oh my gosh. And like, I get it because, I mean, for a long time, I was like, okay, well, it makes sense to right? It makes sense to have like an abortion early on, right? It makes it like it doesn't make any sense at all, right? Like I don't get it when people are like, oh, first trimester abortion? Nah, that's wrong. It's immoral. Because like if you look at nature, like nature does that itself, right? Most miscarriages happen within the first trimester, like 96% of miscarriages. And that's, again, like that's evolution, that's nature, that's how the forces outside of, you know, human choice designed pregnancy. So it really doesn't make any sense to me to be upset over an abortion in the first trimester. Yeah, after that, I mean, you know, I get it. I get where people are coming from. I get why people would say that they don't think anyone should have an abortion after the first trimester. But it's still something that needs to be discussed because there are many reasons, right? Like, and I also want to point out that, like, you know, as far as the reasons that people choose to get abortions, that's something that's important to consider too, because it's very, very common for people to be like, oh, like, we can't just have people deciding that they want abortions or deciding, willy-nilly that they don't want a child and then getting an abortion in the third trimester, right? We can't have that. There's too much of that. And if we make it legal, everyone's going to be doing that. And it's like, nah, that's not going to happen. Like, I think for the most part, like, the most common reason that people have abortions is really because they don't want the child. And you can, like, extrapolate that into any number of reasons, but really there shouldn't be a need for any reasons beyond that. And those tend to happen much earlier on, right? Like, the rate of abortions, period, even in states where abortion is uncontested, the rate of abortion after the first trimester is negligible. And that should be a reflection of, like, how things would scale nationally. Like, most people are not going to go into the third trimester being like, oh, I decided to have an abortion. That being said, we need to look at, like, the people who do get that far and decide that there's an abortion that needs to happen, right? And we need to look at those reasons. As Julia said, like, a lot of times it's risk to child. It's risk to the birther, right? And when you have these blanket, laws, I mean, those things go out the window, right? You take the pro-life people again, and you say, what about these people, right? And they'll be like, oh, maybe we can make an exception for those people. How do you do, like, the logistic effort it takes, energy, to figure out who the exception applies to, who the rule applies to, and all this stuff is just not worth it, I think. Especially given all the other issues we have. So, more nuance.
I just don't think it needs to be a conversation, but I'm guessing what you're saying is that it should be more nuanced since it is a conversation, it's going to be a conversation. But, like, I don't think it needs to be a conversation at all, and it wouldn't, like, shout out to my sister, because I wasn't always like, oh yeah, late term abortions, cool. I was like, yee, like, that feels a little bit more concerning. But the fact is, if you believe in abortion rights and you are, like, pro-abortion and you believe that somebody should get to decide what happens with their body, right, then you encompass all of that. That is something that it feels hypocritical to not accept and honor that an abortion can happen in any period for any reason. And we know that the late term abortion rates are so low, right? Like, that, and people always sensationalize that shit, and they're like, this person had a late term abortion. It's like probably 1 of 5 people in, like, the year or whatever. The rates are just so low. I forget what else I was gonna say, because that shit really upsets me. But there was something else. What did you...
I mean, while you're ruminating, 'cause I don't know. I will say, I don't think that... so when I call for nuance, that isn't to say that... Okay, so what I mean by nuance...
What I was gonna say.
Yeah, in that regard, is that, like, approaching different... Because right now it's like... Because there's also the question of what do we mean by abortion? Oh. Call him back. Yo, Pele, if you're hearing this is you. I'll call you back. So when we think of abortions, we tend to think of the same thing. Abortion, right? Like sucking the baby out of,
easy with all the descriptors. We don't know who's watching.
Yes, you're right. But, we think of, we tend to say, I mean, it's the process. I think
that doesn't mean people want to be reminded of it necessarily.
Yeah, that's true. But, I think I have that vegan approach. Like, if you're going to support it, then, I mean, I do think it's important to, maybe not be reminded. Okay, anyway, like, apologies if I've triggered anyone. I don't remember. Oh, yeah. It's nuance. My point is, abortion can look like a lot of different things. And if we approach this question with more nuance, we make it more acceptable to talk about these things in public, again, with nuance and, like, taking into account all the different situations and scenarios that apply, then we can get to a point, right, in, like, the technology around birthing, right, where we can discuss late-term abortion in a way that people are going to be like, oh, like, oh, that's what you mean? Like, when you describe a certain process. Oh, okay, yeah, like, that sounds good. Right? There's a win-win here, especially with the discussion of late-term abortions that we can get to. And that's not to say that, that's to say that I don't know what the options are now. But if, someone's giving birth or is pregnant in the third trimester and they want to have an abortion, there's only so many options that are available right now. And anyway, I'm going to stop.
Okay. I think if you're talking about having a conversation about how to improve technology for pregnancies and birthings and abortions and other medical necessities, that's great. I think if you're talking about, if we have a more nuanced conversation, then we can convince some of these people it's naively optimistic since this has been going on for decades. So I do think it's important to maintain that hope. I'm just quite bitter about it. And my point from before, too, is that the Supreme Court should not be making medical decisions for people, period. Like, the end. Like, that just should not be happening. Getting an abortion is a medical procedure, right? Like, the fuck? Like, why is a judge deciding that for me, or for anybody else in that capacity, or a lawyer? So, I think that stuff is really fucked up, too. And that can be extrapolated to a lot of different things. And then people will be like, oh, well, do you think that, like, doctor-assisted suicide should be a thing? Yeah. I think there's different discussions to be had around those things. Like, that's not going to catch me out on stuff. And the fact that, like, y'all think that that's, yeah, fuck. It's a medical decision that people get to make and decide on their own. And, yeah, I just think if other people with penises could get pregnant, the conversation would always look different. And that's part of why it's always, when you look at who's signing the laws, there's a lot of penises in that picture.
Yeah, in that room. And
it's not that, uterus folks don't support all of the abortion bans either. But the representation is definitely... it's a stark picture.
Yeah. I just think it is a really annoying thing to have to discuss, for all the reasons you just mentioned and more.
I just got one more point.
Go for it.
I have a lot more points, but we do need to wrap up because I got to work. But, I've been watching this Danish television show, and one of my coping skills is to watch foreign language TV shows. But the main character in the show got pregnant and was like, ooh, shoot, went to a clinic, came home, had a pill, and that was it. And, I can only imagine that probably cost, $5. And I'm not exaggerating, or... whatever the word is for under-exaggerating. Maybe it just still counts as exaggerating. I really can't imagine that cost more than $5 or $10. Came home, took the pill. I'm sure it was, a painful experience to take the pill and, essentially, cause a miscarriage and abort. And I know that it's a TV show, but that's actually how it happens in other places in the world. Yeah. And we're the supposed most developed country that really cares about women and women's rights. That's why we invade, that's why we hate the Taliban and try and, hate these other governments and invade other countries. But here in this country, we can't manage to make any of those things easy. Because I think that's another thing. People are like, oh, it's so easy to have an abortion. And for some people, the access to do it, the emotional toll, all that stuff is fine. But for other people, it's taking time off work, figuring out how to get there, paying the fee, going through the process. Depending on what state you live in, you have to go and talk to these fucking whack jobs about adoption and listen to their whole religious spiel about this shit and then still find a way to go and do it. You know what I mean? It's not you should be able to go literally to any medical facility and get an abortion if that's what you want. And it shouldn't cost you any money, and it should be covered by health insurance that we shouldn't even need to have.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Also, Health insurances don't cover fertility treatments or infertility treatments except in very few states. So, like, the fuck? If you want people to have babies, let people who want to have babies afford to have those babies.
Right.
Okay, I think I'm done now.
And I just settle, like, on that note, I mean, that's part of why I don't think that Twitter take is accurate. I mean, I think, one, we're moving towards a point of, with increasing automation, increasing efficiency of automation and, like, automated productivity with, you know, rising sea levels and, you know, all these things that are just going on. And again, superfluous populations, and this is something that Achille Mbembe, he's a Cameroonian philosopher, talks about, is that governments are dealing with this problem of superfluous populations all over the world, like populations of people internally who they don't want to have anything to deal with. Palestine's an example. Inner city, you know, U.S., like, you know, inner city Chicago, old New York, you know, L.A., all examples. And, you know, again, being in Texas, anyway, I just don't think that's...
I mean, you don't have to agree with it. There's more
Yeah.
to it, but we can talk about it later.
Yeah, we can. I think it's an interesting take, and I don't agree with it. I hope that that's not the future that we're heading towards. And based on, like, what I'm seeing today, it doesn't look like it is. You know, not to say that we're not heading for something equally bleak. I was going to say something about that earlier and I forgot to. Yeah.
Okay. We'll come back around to it.
Yeah.
All right, Jill. Thanks for joining us.
Yes. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.